Welcome, everyone, to the fourth annual Emerging Scholars Symposium, a partnership brought to you specifically by the Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower Presidential Libraries, and I've listed those in the order that they served, and more broadly by the National Archives and Records Administration, which the Presidential Libraries are an important part of. The Emerging Scholars Symposium is the brainchild of my friend and colleague, Joy Murphy, who is the education director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. And it is a program that brings you, the viewer, cutting edge insight and information from a group of scholars who are relatively new to the world of research, scholarship, and the presentation of their findings on a national stage. So we are getting in on the ground floor of what I'm sure is going to be some fantastic careers and a world of research, writing, and education. I'm Jeff Urban. I'm the Education Director at the Roosevelt Presidential Library in Hyde Park. I will be your host and moderator for today and tomorrow's sessions. And I'm so pleased that you've taken the time to tune in and join us here today. And I'm sure you'll want to join in again tomorrow to listen to the exciting and informative information these scholars are going to share with us. The theme for this year's Emerging Scholars Symposium is Waging Peace. And I'd like to point out that that is exactly what each and every one of the three presidents associated with today's symposium was seeking to do. Though they were associated with World War II, the Korean War, and the Cold War, what each of them was trying to do was to bring about peace among all peoples and peace among all nations. That was at the core of their administrations. So our first emerging scholar today is Victor H. Molina. Victor is an associate professor in the School of Design and Architecture at Technical University at Ambato, Ecuador. He earned a Fulbright scholarship to study for a master's degree in global technology and development in Arizona State University. And then he earned a scholarship to study a master's degree in interdisciplinary design for the built environment at the University of Cambridge. He's currently a doctoral student in the Faculty in Architecture of the Built Environment at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, focusing on academic landscapes in Ecuador during the Cold War. Victor, I am so delighted to have you here today. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've been working on?
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thanks to Joy as well, and to the Eisenhower, Roosevelt, and Truman Presidential Libraries for inviting me to take part of this 2024 World War II Emerging Scholars Symposium. Well, I am really happy to share my findings, and it would be a presentation divided in three parts. The first part is we shall do everything in our power, and it's related to the events that took place in the Galapagos Islands and in the US as well, from April 15, 1940 to September 1st, 1940. The second part is called No Further Details Available and narrates events from December 7, 1941 to September 2nd, 1945. And the last part that is called We Are Willing to Have the Lead for Possibilities concludes with events that took place 1 decade later, actually on June 1951, when the Ecuadorian President Galo Plaza visited the US President Harry Truman in Washington, D.C., recalling some of the events that we will explore in part 1 and part 2. Next slide, please. The first part, we shall do everything in our power, begin with an event in Washington. Next slide, please. On April 15, 1940, in the Pan American Union building in Washington, D.C., the U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt declared to the governing board of the Pan American Union that all 21 republics from the Americas must be prepared to meet force with force if their system of peaceful relation is challenged or threatened. The Ecuadorian ambassador in Washington, D.C. at that time, Captain Colón Eloy Alfaro, attended the meeting, as well as other ambassadors from the regions, as we can see in this picture from the Library of the Congress. Next slide, please. A year after that event, on September 1st, 1941, President Roosevelt delivered the first broadcast from his study in the Presidential Library on Labor Day, declaring, "We shall do everything in our power to crush Hitler and his Nazi forces," entering with this broadcast once and all into the global conflagration of the World War II. Next slide, please. Second part, no further details available. Now we are going to move in the presentation as well and the narration from the US, the Galapagos Islands in Ecuador, which is the case we are exploring. Next slide, please. On December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor took place. 4 days after the attack, on December 11, Cape Horn reported strong ground signals of Japanese language in the Galapagos Islands between Fernandina and a northwest point of Isabela. Concurrently, the Ecuadorian Ministry of Defense declared that in the vicinity, 2 large-sized vessels had been observed, including enemy aliens in the islands, leading the US to consider suspicion of Japanese naval forces in the Galapagos by December 15 in the year 1941. Only 4 days later, on December 19, British sources in Guayaquil, a port city in Ecuador, reported a German push plant using the German-owned Equapetrol property near Salinas as a base. The movement would be accompanied by Peruvian advance on Guayaquil, riots in principal cities, overthrow of government, and elimination of allied personnel. End of quote. Once informed, Ecuadorian president at that time expressed willingness, I open quote, to give Salinas or any other place as an air or naval base to the US War and Navy Department. Thanks to the archives, digitalized archives, the Presidential Library, I have been able to retrieve the telegrams or the naval cables from the time. Next slide, please. Although the Galapagos were under US surveillance since September 18, 1941, 3 months ago, 3 months before the events, scrutiny on the islands increased to 4 planes daily from Gulf of Guayaquil, and more sporadically 4 submarines from the Canal Zone from January 3, 1942. After a cable from Santiago de Chile reported a conversation in a Nazi dinner where attendants were boasting imminent victory at the canal. I open quote saying, "First Panama, then Chile," was mentioned repeatedly, no further details available. The cable unavoidably led the US War and Navy Department to occupy the Galapagos Islands with no time for consultation or agreement with the Ecuadorian government to immediately prevent either Nazi or Japanese occupation of the islands. While there is no day for the arrival of the US forces to the Galapagos, on November 11, 1943, the War and Navy Department advised to continue occupation with no agreement of any kind with the Ecuadorian government, perhaps, they said in the document, through inter-American action. In the photograph we are looking at in the screen, we can see actually the telegram that is reported, the location where the hearing of this Japanese language phone strong signals were identified in this case, Banks Bay, between Fernandina and Isabela in the Galapagos. Next slide, please. Once the World War II escalated, and once the US base was established already in the Galapagos Islands, on March 1944, the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt visited the US troops in the Galapagos. The visit started on March 21, and in the first picture we can see from her visit is the image portraying Eleanor Roosevelt autographing sailor caps. Next slide, please. Also, a second image taken during the visit of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt shows First Lady dining in the Army kitchen. The First Lady visit to the deployed troops in the Galapagos ended on March 27, 1944. Next slide, please. By fall, August 1944, a secret military delegation from the Ecuadorian government arrived at Washington, D.C., but failed in the attempt to settle an agreement for the presence of the U.S. forces in the Galapagos Islands. Soon after that, Ecuadorian President José María Velasco wrote a letter congratulating President Roosevelt for the triumph of the United States and the allied nations against Russian and Asiatic imperialism. I close the quote. But recalling his attention on, opening the quote, on certain problems of interest to the Ecuadorian nation. Since it was unsuccessful, the first mission, a new Ecuadorian diplomatic delegation followed on November 15 for delivering the following direct message. Opening quotes. This occupied Galapagos 6 months after war, period. And no circumstance reoccupied without Ecuadorian authority, period. From present moment, joint occupants by Ecuadorian and U.S. forces, period, asked to recognize Ecuador as co-belligerent. End of quote. Nevertheless, World War II continued with battles at the global scale, and for instance, the Galapagos Islands continued under U.S. occupation. On April 12, 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt died. On April 28, it was Benito Mussolini. And just 2 days after that, on April 30, Adolf Hitler. All three world leaders were gone out of Azor. President Roosevelt was succeeded by his Vice President Harry Truman. Nazi Germany was defeated with total and unconditional surrender on May 8, followed by Japan on September 2, 1945. Then World War II officially ended. However, it was not until June 22, 1951, that the Galapagos affair was known to the general public, and it was thanks to the talks of Ecuadorian President Galo Plaza Lasso to U.S. President Harry Truman in the congressional room of the Statler Hotel in Washington, D.C., which is the third part of this presentation, which is called "We Are Willing to Help to the Limit of Our Possibilities." Next slide, please. The visit was planned months in advance, but it was attended with certain details that shows the relevance of this visit. For example, to begin with, the Ecuadorian President Galo Plaza and his party departed from Quito in a U.S. airplane, actually a U.S. Army airplane called Freedom, as we can see in the picture that was took in Quito during the departure. Next slide. On June 20, 1951, US President Harry Truman welcomed Ecuadorian President Galo Plaza in Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. During the welcoming, President Truman said to President Plaza the following words: "It is a great pleasure to welcome you to the United States. We shall do in our power to make your stay among us pleasant and interesting. I am pleased to extend this welcome to you as President of the United States. We share with you a common devotion to the democratic way of life. Your visit is a symbol of the long-standing friendship that has always existed between our two countries. It is a source of gratification that Ecuador and the United States are working together with the other free nations to assure the security and the peace of the world. Our countries are inspired by a high regard of individual freedom and human welfare. We are honored by your visits and more heartily extend our best wishes to you personally for the prosperity and well-being of the people of your great country. President Truman, according to the records in the library, spoke at 3:10 p.m. and President Plaza was received with 21 gun salute and full military honors. The schedule of activities for the week ahead was planned by the minute, and it was intangibly with the proper protocol for a customary visit of a head of state. Next slide, please. However, the agenda of President Plaza in the US went beyond the customary Washington political meetings. It also included business and academic gatherings in New York City and in San Francisco, carried out with unexpected pomp and circumstance. What we see in the picture at the moment is the welcoming party for President Plaza before heading to the White House and with some words to the press. What surprised me is the billboard on the right side of the US flag with a President Plaza portrait, which was surprising to find. Next slide, please. President Plaza was already familiar to town because he was in previous year appointed Ecuadorian ambassador to Franklin D. Roosevelt government in Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. As such, President Plaza related to global affairs and U.S. politics since he participated in both San Francisco Conference and Bretton Woods Conference, becoming a privileged interlocutor between representatives of Latin America countries and the U.S. delegates. Next slide, please. The meetings in June 1951 allowed both President Truman and President Lasso to strengthen a weakened bilateral relation between the United States of America and Ecuador to the overextended U.S. military occupancy of the Galapagos Islands during the World War II. And in the picture, what we are looking at is when they first spoke, they talked, and President Plaza handed a book of Ecuador with pictures of Ecuador and Quito to President Truman. The book was portraying mainly architecture from Quito and some landscape pictures from the Andes and the Pacific areas in Ecuador. And it was accompanied by a very warm invitation from President Plaza to President Truman to visit Ecuador. The visit of President Truman to Ecuador never took place. However, their friendship remained for the rest of both presidential terms. Could you please put the next slide? In the joint statement, following discussion between both presidents, it was stated, on the previous, please. The President of the Republic of Ecuador and the President of the United States of America have met in Washington, D.C., and have reaffirmed in their determination to continue their support of the efforts of the United Nations to reestablish peace in the world. They will remain steadfastly united in the present emergency. The two nations solemnly declare their attachment to the principles set forth in the charters of the United Nations and of the Organizations of American States, and in other international agreements to maintain peace and security. They intend to defend themselves against aggression, to settle their disputes by peaceful means, improve the living standards of their peoples, promote their cultural and economic progress, and ensure respect for the fundamental freedoms of man and principles of social justice that are the basis for the democratic systems. However, it was during the special dinner, and thanks to the toast of Ecuadorian President Plaza to the US President Harry Truman in the congressional room of the Statler Hotel in Washington, that we recall the events that took place a decade earlier in the Galapagos Islands. In the picture, what we see is on the left side, President Harry Truman, on the right side, President Galo Plaza, and in between both, in the middle of both, Mr. Rosario Paliares Plaza, the wife of Ecuadorian President Galo Plaza. During this dinner and in the toast of President Plaza said the following words, and I open the quote: "In times like this, I think it is appropriate to repeat what I have been saying at different opportunities. All the countries of the free world, and the countries of Latin America in particular, and speaking from my own country, we realize our responsibilities, and we are willing to help the limit of our possibilities." He continued, opening the quote: "At the beginning of the last war, a few hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Ecuador offered the United States the use of the Galapagos Islands and points on the coast of Ecuador, without any strings attached to them. Just a contribution, a small contribution, but our contribution, the very minute an emergency appeared." And in his final words during the President Plaza said, "And I want to make clear that if such an emergency came about again, my country, Ecuador, would be willing to put at the disposal of the United States and the United Nations the same facilities as before, or any others that we might have that might prove worldwide to the cause of the free world." Then President Truman, raising the glass, invited the audience to toast with the following words: "My friends, to His Excellency, the President of Ecuador." Next slide, please. President Plaza also attended a joint session of Congress in the U.S. Capitol on Thursday, 21 of June, 1951. And in the picture, we are looking at the arrival of the party, President Plaza and the party, to the Capitol. Next slide, please. I haven't been able to find the transcription of the address of President Plaza to the Congress, but what is in archives is what President Truman said about the intervention of President Plaza. And President Truman, joking around, said, opening quotes, "The Vice President reported to me, sir, that you had made the best speech that the Congress has listened to in many a day, and I made them an address last January." Next slide, please. Still in Washington on Saturday, 23 June, President Plaza visited the Organization of American States at the Pan American Union building, the same building where 11 years earlier, on April 15, 1940, this story began with President Roosevelt, as we might recall from the beginning of this presentation. Later in life, President Plaza would become the General Secretary of the Organization of American States for 7 years. Next slide, please. To conclude, the visit in New York City, Ecuadorian President Galo Plaza was interviewed by Eleanor Roosevelt for WNBC. Finally, Plaza attended a meeting of the Bullock Forum at 1 Wall Street, but that one is a whole different story for the next time we meet. Next slide, please. In 2011, I was able to visit the Galapagos Islands for first time. And just upon arrival at the Baltra Airport in the Galapagos, there is a shuttle that brings all airplane passengers from the airport to Canal Itabaca, which is a crossing for entering officially or physically the Santa Cruz Islands in the Galapagos. So it is a quite exciting trip because you are just entering a whole different environment. And in the way the shuttle was taking us from the airport to Canal Itabaca, I was able to see some of these remains, some of these constructions that remain from what was the U.S. Seymour base, military base, that was in the occupation of World War II. The picture obviously is abandoned U.S. military construction, and it is what remains 8 decades after the U.S. occupation and 7 decades after the presidential toss in Washington, D.C., recalling the Galapagos Islands. Nowadays, however, the Galapagos Islands have become a hotspot for scientific research on the critical relevance of healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, as well as for assessing the impact of climate change and on small islands environment. Personally, on the previous year, since my university became part of the board of directors of the Charles Darwin Foundation, since the president of my university was the president of the University of Ecuador, I was the delegate to attend the meetings. And what is going on in the Galapagos regarding research on biodiversity, on small island environments is truly remarkable, and I think it brings awareness to all of us on the relevance of these places. However, during the time I was serving as delegate to the board of directors, eventually the focus of the research is biology, marine biology, but what the islands bring to researchers now, and thanks to what I have found in the archives, looks like there is a lot also of material to research about history and about global history as well. So I do personally believe in collaboration and cultural exchange, no military occupation, is the way forward to the Galapagos Islands. Could you please put the next slide? Galapagos is a privileged place in Ecuador, a living lab, I could say, where marine and terrestrial species, including humans, could learn how to cohabit the small planet we share. What we are looking at the picture is the Bartolome Island in the Galapagos, and is in the first part of the picture. In behind Bartolome, there is the island of Santiago, and the aim of this presentation was to bring back to collective memory those events that allowed the strengthening of bilateral relations between the United States of America and the Republic of Ecuador. And I know that all the struggle it could have brought to the friendship both countries have had for so long, I wouldn't be able to make adjustment on decision that was taken at that time, because conditions are whole different and as now or today. But it is important to recall every one of those events, and it's important to access through reliable sources, because neglected memories and forgotten events could be as harmful as misleading comments and fake news. That is why the approach is to build knowledge by reassembling such memories and events with a contemporary perspective on political history. Before ending my presentation, I would like to thank for the digitalizations of the U.S. National Archives that made this research possible. The methodology design included retrieval of information from Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, Harry Truman Presidential Library and Museum, and Eisenhower Presidential Library, amongst other possible sources. And I was quite surprised because actually many of the information I was able to retrieve was not known before, and I am pretty sure hasn't been published in Ecuador, in my own country. So how relevant is to keep those archives in such a good manner and with access that we can retrieve from all over the world, and even to learn our own history is pretty remarkable. I hope we together found out how shared values and confluent interests can be beneficial to bilateral relations of democratic countries, but also for waging peace and for building trust and integration in regional and global contexts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. That was very informative. I want to go over now to the questions, and one of them is that you said that after President Plaza left office in Ecuador, he went on to become the president of the American states. What impact did he have there, the Organization of American States?
Well, yeah, thanks for the question, Jeff. Actually, well, after the visit to President Truman, Galo Plaza came back home, and he stayed 2 more years in his presidential term. Once he ran for re-election, he lost the re-election against Jose Maria Velasco Ibarra, and it was quite surprising because he was doing a really good job. But it looks like populism won at that time. The presidential election, and so President Plaza left the country. He went to the US and started to work in the United Nations. He was a peace negotiator for several conflicts all over the world, in Greece, in Africa, and he was quite successful. And so he spent around 10 years in the United Nations as a peace envoy. And after that, with the support of the United States, he was named General Secretary of the Organization of American States. And during his term as General Secretary, he did work really hard for the integration of the Americas, and also for the promotion of democracy, and for the security of the hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere. So I would say that he got the position when he was mature enough to look beyond the borders of one country and to think about the regional context, and to think about how democracy could help all the region to develop. We could also recall that on those years, Alliance for Progress was being deployed in the Americas. So he was actively promoting as well the development of the Americas through these programs. And in history, he stayed until he was close to 90 years old, active, always trying to promote peace, security, and democracy. So quite a successful career.
Wow, that's amazing. Here's another question. What impact did the American attitudes toward Ecuador have leading up to the war? So I think what the person is asking is you say within days the Ecuadorian government said, "Hey, here's the Galapagos. Use these guys. We're going to give you land for bases." What? How was the relationship before that? I mean, there had to have been a good relationship, I think, is what the person is asking.
Yeah, I think there has been always a good relation between the United States and Ecuador, and at that time, but according to some records that I am still looking at, looks like at some point there was also some approaches from Italia, especially airplane flights sent by Mussolini as explorer missions to Ecuador. But also, it is recalled in some records the visit of one of the ministries from the National Socialist government to the presidential inauguration of President Carlos Arroyo del Rio. So it didn't happen only in Ecuador, it did happen all over Latin America, that all those global powers at that time, Italy, Germany, were trying to get into the region. So the trigger to me looks like it was this listening of Japanese language in some trips that were around the islands. So that triggered that there was something going on about the islands, because the islands are somehow far away from the continent. It's close to 800 miles, 1,000 kilometers from the coast of Ecuador. But obviously, speaking about geopolitical terms, those are very prominent positions. So I would say that once British sources declared that there was an attempt of bringing an advanced mission from Germany to Ecuador, Ecuador had to take part. And at the moment they took part, it was towards the U.S. and the security of the continent.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting, because if folks take a look at their Central and South American map, what you'll see is Ecuador is on the northwest sort of corner of South America, in a perfect view and strategic position to defend the Panama Canal and of course the Galapagos Islands out there as well. So this was a really important step that they were able to do. Pearl Harbor was put out there. The base at Pearl Harbor was to project power into the Pacific Rim, hoping to keep the Japanese out of messing around with North and South America. And of course, the Japanese were trying to knock us out of the war and had their eyes on maybe access or control of the Panama Canal. So Ecuador really was critical in defending that part of the very, very important part of the world in terms of ship passage back and forth. Another question we have here is,
Jeff,
how much?
Just to add something, actually.
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, before the question. So actually, Jeff, what you say is very important because all documents that are related to the Galapagos, they don't talk about Ecuador. They talk about the Panama Canal zone. Mm-hmm. So the submarines actually departed from Panama to the Galapagos. The airplanes from Salinas, but the submarines to the Galapagos. And if you see at the map of South America, actually Ecuador has, in the coastline, has the most prominent geographical point in South America, which is Salinas, the port of Salinas. They put into the service of the U.S. forces. But also the Galapagos are in the equator. What is interesting, because later in the research, which is not part of this call, I found that, for example, when the U.S. During the Eisenhower presidential term, when they were deploying, the U.S. was deploying all the satellites in response to this Sputnik launch and the starting of the space race. One of the points for the military stations in the Americas is actually Quito. is a point really close to Quito, maybe 40 miles from South Quito, which is the Cotopaxi Paramo. And later in history, still during Eisenhower presidential term, Galapagos Island were also considered for a launch pad for satellites because of the strategic geopolitical position in the equator. So yeah, Galapagos still came once and again during the following presidential terms as a strategic point, and maybe that's one of the reasons also that we kept in both countries this friendship, because we knew it was some sort of several points of collaboration.
Speaking to that point, we have a question. How much of Gallo Plaza's support was influenced by his personal relationship with the United States? Was he born in the United States? Did he go to school in the United States? What made him so enamored with interaction with the United States, personally and as president?
In the Galapagos.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the most surprising thing for me was the visit of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. If you send the First Lady to a military base, it's not any military base. It must have been some really important things going on there. And she spent 1 week in the Galapagos, actually. And if you go, because it is key to understand that when you think about islands in the Pacific, you might recall on your memory some images or landscape as the islands in the Caribbean, when you see the palms and those really nice beaches with really white sand and beautiful. Well, Seymour Base, which is Baltra Island, is a rock. It's actually a rock and has no beaches at all. It's a rock under the sun, and it could reach really high temperatures. When I was studying in Arizona during my Fulbright scholarship, I could experience how hot it could get. But when I was visiting the Galapagos, it was the same sense as being in a desert. So it's a very hot rock in the middle of the Pacific with really strange vegetations and fauna. So not a paradise. So the First Lady spent 1 week in the Galapagos, and the military base stayed, from documents I have been able to retrieve from the Organization of American States, the troops until 1946, and the islands returned to the sovereignty of Ecuador in 1948. By the time I went to the Galapagos in 2011, what we have now is not traces. For example, there is no American school in the Galapagos, but what we have now is many NGOs related to conservancy, natural conservancy, working in the islands. Okay. So, but speaking openly, there is no trace of what was in there, except those constructions. So that's what made me curious. When I was in the Galapagos, I asked first, what is that? And so they said, you didn't know that there was a base in here? And I didn't know. So it's not the common knowledge of Ecuadorians. And I think we should explore more in that, because it actually adds some more content on a visit you do to the islands, which are really worth to visit just for the sake of nature and biodiversity. But recalling events in history, it makes much more interesting.
I agree. It's interesting, 1823, the Monroe Doctrine, and then the 1930s, the Good Neighbor Policy, then the 1960s, the Alliance for Progress. There doesn't seem to have, it seems like exactly what you're saying, Victor, is that our attention to South and Central America seems to have have fallen by the wayside. I mean, obviously, there was a big election in Mexico, just yesterday. But am I missing anything? Was there anything? The Salvadorian Revolution and such. But was there anything in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s that was analogous to a great progress for alliance and a good neighbor policy, or am I just missing it?
Well, I would say that maybe I might be because I am closer to the experience, but I think one of the most successful ways of cooperation we have had is the Fulbright scholarship. Actually, it is by hundreds the people who benefited from that. Ecuadorians that we have traveled to the US in the last 4 years, and also researchers and scholars from the US that come, and it happens every year. By the time I went on the Fulbright scholarship, we went a group of 16 people. So you imagine how beneficial it has been for Ecuador to have this chance to host, to bring people to the US, to share the experiences in a university campus. When you want to do is build knowledge and to build bridges for cooperation and for this friendship of people, for working together. Following on my studies, I have been able to bring back several summer schools abroad from Arizona State universities and from other groups that are welcome in this land as well. So it is the way, I think, is the way that we could promote more exchange. Exchange not as patronizing, exchange as peers who work towards the same goals. How do we cohabit this planet in a much peaceful and a much nicer way?
I think that's wonderful. It's right on target. This idea of peer-to-peer interaction, we begin to realize, we're all in the same boat. We're all in this little marble floating around out in space, and we can have different political views and different economic approaches and things. But the bottom line is we all have to share this one spot. So what got you interested in this? Like, let's switch over to to learn a little bit more about you. We've learned a little bit about your research. So, other than obviously being a native, what got you interested in this relationship, in this sort of, as you say, this sort of lost consciousness or memory of this collective memory?
Yeah, I am researching about university campuses. Okay, and universities campuses in Quito. So there are 3 main university campuses that came by the mid of the 20th century. The first, the campus of Central University of Ecuador, starting 1939, but most properly in 1950s. Then the campus of Catholic University, and the last one, the campus of the Polytechnic School. So we were guessing what were the conditions in which those campuses came to be. And why just after the World War II? Yeah. So it is just by chance. It is just a decision from a president that I said, I want a university. But no, it looks like it was the whole context.
Yeah.
And the whole context for cooperation. So when President Plaza was visiting the US, he went to the University of Maryland after meeting President Truman. He went to the University of Maryland and also the Agricultural School particularly, and then the University of Berkeley. And he was visiting his former schools because he was educated on those universities. When he came back from the US, he really committed national resources in order to make this first university campus came to place.
Wow.
And it's not a small amount of money. It was a really push in order to to open the possibility for Ecuadorians to be educated in engineering, to promoting industry, to go towards development. So, but there are some patterns in the design of the campus of Central University that change when the other two campuses open. And also some part of history that tells us that they were trying to be some other influence also in the campuses. So that's why it comes to the Cold War exploration, because it was not only the US who wanted to have some influence in the education of in higher education, but also some other forces, and that's what made me bring back. So when exploring this campus plans, actually I came with President Plaza, and when looking at why President Plaza supported in such a strong way the development of the campus, well, there was this visit, and the visit was framing the whole strategy for the next 2 years he was in presidential term. So the guess is, what if we had a president that has not this experience of living in a university campus, that was not educated at such level? Right. Would we have the same university as we have now? So it is also a matter of national priorities, but it's also serendipitous events that make things come to place. Mm-hmm. Like it's in all parts.
That's a wonderful point. Personalities, people's influences. It matters who you have at the top, because their experiences, their influences are going to have an impact on what it is that they do, which has an impact down the way. And I think you're right. If you'd gone back and just created one university, it wouldn't have had the momentum that the three or four that you mentioned sort of created a synergy, really. Now I'm interested to know. So you got interested in that, and you began to take a look at this. What while you were doing your research for the topic, was there a particular discovery that you discovered that was just a big surprise? I mean, did you have a by golly, I didn't know that kind of a moment that just like jumped out at you in all the research?
Yes, Jeff, actually is everything. I had no idea. I had no idea that all this happened. And in the books of history, I have been learning from basic school through college, there is no recall of these events. And I think it should be told to new generations how cooperation works, how education works, how one event could trigger so many other things that could be beneficial for entire societies. So, as you said, what, for example, if I wouldn't have the chance to get a Fulbright scholarship and I wouldn't have the chance to study in the US, I wouldn't be able to speak English. I wouldn't have been able to retrieve information from the presidential libraries. And what if the presidential libraries wouldn't have this motivation to put all their archives in such care, open to the world? Mm-hmm. So all those small efforts that every one of us make in any place on the world, actually in the right moment and with the right motivation, for example, in this case, the call you made, Waging for Peace, could trigger research and could trigger this gathering of knowledge for sharing with the society. And it might us rethink that we make history, and we make history with every decision we take. And if we take the right decisions, the history that will come down the way would be beneficial. If the wrong decisions, it would be the opposite. But yeah, looking at the resources we have, being responsible and objective and really critical on the information we are managing and presenting it to the public in a way that made us feel proud that past collaboration and past experience
Mhm.
could bring better futures for us, for the coming generations as well.
That's a great point. Our actions of today are the history of tomorrow. And if we can instill that in our students, if we can instill that in our citizens, if we can instill that in our politicians, our leaders, our presidents of colleges, universities, those sorts of things, it really is important to sort of seed the clouds for the next generation, that comes along. And Victor, I think what's really interesting about your research is that it's built on such a rich foundation. I mean, I have a degree in Latin American Caribbean affairs, so I knew a little bit about this, but you've really uncovered this great foundation upon which the rest of this information and cooperation can be built. And I think that's that's really really important. So what is next for you, sir? What are you you're finishing up your doctoral degree, and what happens next for you personally?
This is the most difficult question of the day. Well, before answering the question, I would like also to highlight the importance of photography. All the pictures we have seen are beautiful, uh, are part of history, are truly to the events, and were taken in such a way. I am thinking about the photographers as well. They had one chance to take one image. There is no second chance for a photography. You put history, you stop history and put that for eternity in one shot. And you miss the shot or you take the shot. And thankfully, there is a lot of good photographies. We could read facial expressions. We can also be transported to the moment and to understand when you read a text and you have the photograph, then you have two sources to understand, to get into. And so, yeah, I think, the preservation of images and photography is also quite interesting. What's coming next? I am in my last year of the doctoral studies. Hopefully, I'm working hard on my writing. It will be done by April next year. So I am actually I have a permanent position in a public university in Ecuador, in the School of Architecture, but also with the trust of the president of my university, I am in charge of designing the future university campuses. So in the time I've been doing the research, I have also been designing the new branches of the university or the new campuses.
Wow.
So what I am learning from this and what we are learning as a academic community is that the design of a university campus is not only a matter of architecture, it's a matter of understanding the historical context where we are at, and also trying somehow, because it's not easy, trying to project in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years what this campus would inspire in the people. If we think that in average, one person spent 5 years of his life in a university campus, it is a lot of time. If we have the chance to build university campuses in such a way to help people to transform their lives, to learn something that is really valuable, and to get the mission that they could transform society, then we will accomplish our mission as well. So it's not just a matter of adding buildings to a place. It's a matter of creating an atmosphere, an environment for changing lives. So that's the goal.
That's great. Yeah, the buildings are important, but what goes on inside those buildings and what goes on inside the minds of the people in those buildings is all the more important. Victor, I want to thank you for your presentation and for you spending your time with us. I also want to extend an invitation to you that here we are two different places having this conversation. If you're ever interested in having some distance learning to your students in your classroom, let us know, and we can certainly go ahead and do that. And I also want to point out to everybody that's watching, primary source documents, right? That is what it's all about, whether it's photographs, whether it's documents, whether it's trip itineraries, all the things that Victor used in his research. So important, because they help to tell part of the story. They help to tell part of the authentic story. And as Victor pointed out, that information is there, and it's there to be used. So hopefully there'll be some future scholars that'll be emerging that we'll have on the show here, 5 or 6 years from now. But Victor, all the best on getting your work wrapped up. We'll be thinking about you between now and April. Thanks so much for spending time with us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much, Joy. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.